ready for takeoff.
Hello, everyone. How you doing? RubyConf's going so good so far? Yeah, I felt a little enthusiastic in the front here, but not in the back so much. It's going good? It's great? Woo! Awesome. Well, we're going to talk about something which hopefully won't bring down the mood too much, which is how hard it is to bring change into your organizations. It's really challenging. I don't know if anyone's ever experienced wanting to do something different, the company they work for, see a couple head nods, hand raises. Did you experience any challenges at all? None. It was perfectly seamless, perfect. It was amazing. For those of us who are not as fortunate as you, who have experienced some challenges, I hope in our time together we'll present a framework on how to really grapple with that. And we call this talk Changing the Climate Before Changing the Weather. And hopefully we'll see why in just a couple minutes. So I want to start with a bit of an axiomatic truth, I believe, that workplaces are difficult. They're challenging. They're challenging on many different layers. They're difficult often to get onboarded into. You know, as the experience of a new employee in an organization, even with the best onboarding docs, right? The best onboarding guides, it can be really hard to figure out what exactly you're supposed to be doing in that first 30 days, 60 days, 90 days. You may be the kind of person that wants to feel productive, and when you start in a new company, you have a challenge finding that experience of productivity because you're just engaging in a lot of learning, and learning doesn't necessarily feel productive even though it's really productive and you don't know what you should be learning, etc. It can be really, really hard to find your place in a company. Who are your people that you should be getting to know? Who are the communities within the company that is important to get your job most effectively done? Unless you have a mentor, a buddy system of some sort, it can be really, really hard. And as a result, it can just be hard to feel like you're getting your job done. But in the context of our conversation, workplaces, I want to focus in on what is most notoriously difficult about workplaces. And perhaps we can say the same for organizations writ large, that workplaces are notoriously difficult at adapting to change. Really hard. The larger the organization, even though it doesn't necessarily correspond with size, but oftentimes that could be the experience, the slower it moves, the slower it adapts, the more resistors there are to those changes. So in our time together, in the next few minutes, we're going to try and do three things. We're going to try and address why exactly is that the case? Why are workplaces so hard to change? And then we're going to show a three-step framework to help perhaps address this kind of problem, this kind of issue, and how you might be able to affect change in your organization. And lastly, we'll conclude with one relatively compact practical example that illustrates that framework in action. Sound good? Good, awesome. So, but first of all, I just got on the stage and I started talking to you. You're like, who is this guy talking to me about things? Was he invited to speak here? Maybe he just took up the spot, I don't know. So hello everyone, my name is Ben. I work as a developer relations engineer at a company based in Germany called Parity Technologies. And I myself am a second career developer. I previously spent a decade working as a congregational rabbi and a community organizer throughout the US before I came and moved to Israel, and now I'm based outside of Tel Aviv in Israel. On the side, I do a couple small projects for fun. One of them is called Hire the Pivot, because I really am passionate about people like me, career transitioners, people have taken that brave, courageous step to move forward into a new career. So it's a reverse job board written in Rails for second career developers. And I do write an occasional newsletter, not as often as I would like, that tries to find the intersection between hummus and Ruby on Rails. My two favorite passions in life, good hummus and good Rails. So it's really great to be here. So let's try and understand the problem. What is going on when we talk about the challenges of workplace adaptation? That's a very live microphone. Okay, so what essentially is an organization? Because we have to start at the very beginning. When we talk about organizations, we talk about companies, what are we actually talking about? What we're actually talking about from a systems theory perspective is any organization, whether it's your workplace, whether it's your meetup group, whether it's your family, particularly your family, but for our context, your workplace. A workplace is made up of many different smaller systems, subsystems that come together to form that greater whole. So for example, let's say you're on, because this is a Ruby conference, let's say you're on one of the back-end teams, right? You may interact with the front-end developers pretty regularly. You may interact with the DevOps, CI/CD kind of people pretty often as well. You may interact with product managers, hopefully a good, healthy relationship. You probably don't interact with the marketing and the inbound sales people that often, if at all, maybe at company retreats once a year or something. And you probably will interact with human resources at some point throughout each year for a party or a gift they're sending you, and hopefully nothing negative, but just those lovely gifts they send in the mail, things like that. But despite how little or how much you interact with these different entities, all of them come together to form that larger whole, which is sort of like a good, well-designed Rails app, in the sense that every Rails app is made up of the MVC framework, models, views, and controllers, right? And every single model, every single view, every single controller should ideally function independent and be able to, its code should not have to know about what's going on inside the other thing, but yet they all come together to form the greater application, right? The model is built not assuming it knows about the controller and vice versa, but a model without a controller, a view without a model, etc., they're not going to work if you don't all bring them together into one larger application. So similarly, at the end of the day, they're all part of a larger whole, which is the same with your company or your organization. That all these parts, human resources, the back-end team, the front-end team, they're all together. In some ways, each of your departments is kind of like its own smaller climate in a company. We're circling back, right, to the title. Each of your departments is kind of like its own climate, its own culture. And together, what do they form? What's the title? The weather, exactly. All together, the different subclimates, you're brilliant. You're right on it with me. I see you. We're connected, I get it. So all together, they come to form the larger whole, the larger weather. So given that framework of trying to understand organizations, I want to present to you a screenshot of something that may or may not look familiar to you. This is from a Slack bot called the Gender Inclusive Slack bot. Anyone familiar with this? Yeah, I see actually a good amount of hands. So maybe your company uses asynchronous chat platforms like Slack, etc. And at some point, it was discussed or it happened, it was implemented, this gender inclusive Slack bot. And what's the notion of the gender inclusive Slack bot? That in companies with multiple genders, all genders represented, when you're addressing a group of people, you should address the maximum number of people you can in a room and not just the people who identify as male in the room, right? So instead of, hey guys, hey all, hey folks, hey y'all, so many options. And I happen to love this example for many reasons. The reason I really like this example is because the ask of the people in the room, in the company, is pretty small. The ask is to change a word when you're addressing the group, right? But the net positive result of doing that can be quite large. So I love this example for us to hone in on to talk about organizational change, because what's the experience sometimes like when this conversation happens? Sometimes it's really, really positive. And I've been in those rooms, in those companies where it's been really positive. Other times it's something like this. Everyone is shouting into their laptops, and these are all, by the way, all generated with generative AI things, with prompts. So sometimes, the experience is everyone's shouting into their laptops and screaming, no, yes, no, and it's a fight. And the public square becomes more like a boxing ring of your company, and everyone's shouting. At the end of the day, you're making a small ask that could bring about a positive net change, and yet the reaction can be like that. And what's challenging about this is we often think that our companies are filled with relatively intelligent people. What? I love that instantaneous reaction. It's just like, right there. It was like a psychological test of some sort. When I say that, what do you say? What? We often think, and there's whole conversations to be had the way that we hire. In fact, I have given talks on that conversation, the way that we conduct hiring, and there's so many challenges about that. But what those tests and whiteboarding challenges, can you implement a bubble sort algorithm on a whiteboard and reverse a string without using reverse and all kinds of interesting things? What they're trying to do, and I think they do it spectacularly horrible, but what they're trying to do is they're trying to filter for intelligence, right? And Einstein, I think, so aptly said that what is the ultimate measure of intelligence? It's the ability to change, the ability to take in new information, process it, and adapt. And yet, if that's the measure of intelligence, we, and I include myself in this we, and maybe some of you as well, we so often fail at that. So often. So when we point the finger at the people in our company, we should also point the finger at ourselves. We so often fail. And I think the reason why it could be from the nuanced sort of positioning of this expression from Einstein, from the late Harvard paleontologist Stephen Gould, who said that single facts almost, and I love this evocative language, almost never slay worldviews, at least not right away. Meaning, when you get in a new piece of information that challenges the way you do something, challenges how you think, how you operate, well, an intelligent person, according to Einstein, would take it in, process it, think about it, and adapt. But we're not just intelligent people, we're also emotional people. We're also irrational people. All of us. We have a lot of things going on in our head. And one of those things going on in our head is people generally don't like being wrong. They generally dislike the experience of being told the way they're doing something, the way they've done it for their entire life. Maybe there ought to be a better way. Oftentimes, that is not a positive experience for a person. So given that, if people don't like generally being wrong or feeling like they're being told they're being wrong, or don't like the change because it challenges the way they do things, so then how do you ever bring about change? It's a fundamental question. Without forcing it and causing a lot of discontented people, how do you ever bring about change? So that's what we're going to do together. We're going to present 3 possible paths as part of a larger framework of how to bring that change and how move that the prompt for that, by the way, was moving an angry mountain. I think that pretty much encapsulates it. To move that angry, discontented mountain forward with some framework, a loose framework for a change. So we start from, where does the change come from? You're in your company. Your company is multifaceted, multi-layered, regardless if it's 800 people or 10 people. There's a lot of complexity in a company. And you are somewhere over there in the company. And you've maybe been there for a few months, maybe been there for a few years. It doesn't really matter. You have an idea, a new way of doing something. Maybe it's a new way to assign reviewers to pull requests. Maybe it's a new way. You say you should squash the commits. They say they should rebase the commits. And you are starting a whole conversation, and you raise your hand. And you say, excuse me, I have a question. I think there might be something better to do here. I want to first offer the fact, the reality, want to let us in the right positioning, that the very act of doing that, of raising your hand with a suggestion, can be, for many of us, absolutely, completely terrifying. When you give in, and the idea that a company is really complex, full of many different layers and a lot of people, and you kind of feel like you're just one of the masses, to stand out, whether it's remotely or in person, whether it's on an asynchronous chat platform or it's during a daily stand-up or what have you, can feel really terrifying. So the first thing that needs to be articulated is to have courage, to take the action. But courage, you're not born with it. You're not born with courage. Courage is something you develop. It's something you articulate over time, something you build. And I love this quote from Maya Angelou because I think it's so eloquent and so profound in its simplicity, right? So she says that people are not born with courage. You develop it by doing small, courageous things. And then she gives this example. Maybe you want to be a person who lifts 50-pound bags of rice. You know, that's an aspiration. We all want to lift 50-pound bags of rice in our life. We don't just start with a 50-pound bag of rice. I mean, maybe you do, but most of us don't start with 50-pound bags of rice. We typically would start with a 5-pound bag of rice, get the strength, then go to 10-pound, to a 25-pound, to then one day we can look at the 50-pound bag of rice and like, yeah, I got that. I can do that easily. But that moment didn't come from nowhere. That moment came from going through a process, a journey of doing small things to build that strength. So too, with taking the ability, with fostering the courage, inculcating that sense in yourself that you can raise your hand in a company, in an organization, and say something. And like Maya Angelou, I often think, because from my own tradition, I think of a Jewish ethicist from the early 1900s in Poland who changed the face of Jewish ethics for over 100 years. And he talks about later in his life, during his career, how he first, when he just became a new young rabbi and he wanted to go out in the world and change everything. I'm going to change the world. Have you ever thought, like, I'm going to change the world? You graduate college, you throw your cap in the air, like, yes, the world is mine. And then you realize you fail. You can't change the world. It's really, really hard. There's a lot of resistors. So he said, you know what? Can't change the world. I'm going to go back and just change my city. Those are the folks I know, people I grew up with. This is my community. So I'm going to go back to my city in Poland, and I'm going to change just my city. He also failed. In fact, that might have even been harder than trying to change the world. Can you imagine trying to change your neighbors? That's an audacious proposition. So he said, okay, I'm going to pivot again. I'm going to try and just change myself. And at that point, he succeeded. But just changing himself, he didn't end there, right? Because I told you, he changed, this is Rabbi Israel Kagan, he ended up changing the face of Jewish ethics for over 100 years. Tremendous ways. He really succeeded in changing an entire community. But it started with himself. So the first principle is to be what you want to see. If you want to see it happen, it starts with you. It cannot start actually any other way. Any other way. This is the way. It has to start with you. The second principle, I think, is most articulated, at least in my reference points, from a person named Saul Alinsky, who was the father of community organizing in sort of the mid-20th century in the United States in Chicago. And he forced us as a society to center on a notion of self-interest. And so often in the ethics that we're raised in and the cultures that we come from, we see self-interest as a dirty word. We see it as something to not talk about, to shy away from. You're not supposed to have self-interest. You're supposed to be interested in others, altruistic. But Alinsky says if you ignore self-interest, you actually won't be able to accomplish anything. Because self-interest is integral. Because in every single person, every single human is made up of so many competing wants and desires, fears, hopes, dreams. Things that make us, every one of us in this room right now, make us get up in the morning and do the things we do. The things that make us push and do that annoying JIRA ticket we don't want to do. Because we're composed of these things in our head. And if you want to bring change in the world, yes, you start with yourself. But if you only end with yourself, you'll accomplish minimally. To start building change, what you need to do, you need to build power with other people. And the way you build power with other people is to identify the self-interest of others and to build a shared narrative for change with the self-interest of other humans. But how do you do that? Do you just go up to somebody and be like, hey, you, the person who was able to make change without any resistance, can you tell me what your hopes and dreams are in life? Can you reveal to me your deepest fears and wants? We just met, but I would love to know them. That could be a bit of an awkward conversation. But you do it by really having intentional, active listening conversations with people. Now, when I first was learning community organizing, many years ago, and I was taught by one of my educators, active listening. Like, yeah, of course, we all active listen. We listen all the time. What are you talking about? I'm listening to you actively. I listen to this person actively. I'm listening to everyone actively. right? Because I'm not passive, I'm active. So wrong. Active listening is actually really challenging. And we can collapse active listening into kind of 5 elements. The 5 elements that I think are important for this conversation is first, when you're listening to somebody else, pay attention to them. How often in the hallway track of RubyConf, in the past day, 2 days or so, were you in a conversation with somebody, and as they were talking, a part of your brain was thinking about what you're going to say immediately when their mouth stops? How normal is that? That's so normal. Because you don't want to have a lull in the conversation. So you immediately, while you're listening, a part of you is also thinking what you're going to say. In active listening conversations, that can't happen. The second thing, how often when you're listening to somebody, do you start judging? Kind of saying, well, that's a weird idea. Where did they get that from? What? I don't think that way. So part of active listening is, 1, to stop thinking what you're going to say next. Second, stop judging as they're talking. So what are you meant to do if you're not judging, which is so fun so often, and you're not thinking what you're going to say next? What are you supposed to be doing? Reflecting. You're listening, and you're in the moment. You know, you could be in a busy room, you could be in your lunchroom at a company like a traditional office, you could be anywhere, and the world's around you, but in the moment, the best one-to-ones, it's just you and that person. And you're with that person exclusively. And you are just reflecting on the experience of what they're saying. How does it make you feel? What kind of emotions is it bringing up? Reflecting in that moment. And then when it's your turn to speak, what are you meant to say? You're not supposed to judge them, which was the whole point of civil discourse. If you can't judge somebody, you're not supposed to judge them. And you're supposed to be paying attention, so you don't have immediately a quip to say right away. So what do you say instead? You clarify and you summarize. Clarification is super important because clarification makes sure that they get another opportunity to let you know what they meant, even if you didn't understand it, especially when you didn't understand it right away. So I thought you said this. Is that what you said? Summary is, this is what I heard you say. And you do that enough with enough people, you start understanding sort of the fabric of the team you're on, what moves people, what motivates people, and you're coming with your self-interest. Because self-interest is not a bad word. You're coming with your self-interest, which is you want to bring about a change. And you start listening, and then after the conversation, when you walk away, that's when you start thinking about tactics and strategies, not in the conversation. So the second principle is to seek to understand the self-interest of others. And the third idea, the third sort of principle in our framework is from a research done in Harvard Business Review in 2021, that most of our life is routine. We spend most of our life doing the things that we always do from morning until we go to sleep. We may think we're making a lot of free choices, using free will, but we're usually not. We're kind of just doing the things we just do. So if you want to bring about change that's lasting, you slowly integrate one thing at a time and make that part of the new routine. You constitute a new routine with a new thing. The new thing could be additive or reductive. You either are changing something, reducing it, removing it, or you're adding a new thing. One step at a time until it becomes routine. So how does that work? Now you've done your self-interest conversations, you understand the narrative and people, and you're in your team and you understand there's some folks who agree with you. That research showed that the ideal group of people to start bringing about change in a business is about 2.5% of the company. 2.5% to start with. Then that 2.5% start doing this routine plus one, small changes, incorporating them, which grows to 20%. 20%, you're now in something what's called significance. People in the company know it's happening. They understand there's something going on. And they can either buy in or they can ask, they can start clarifying, it's happening. When you reach a 60% threshold, that's standardization. Now, standardization is not the same thing as it is the only way. It is now a possible path. It is normal in the company. It's part of the culture of the company as one of the options. But once you hit 80%, that's when it's fully integrated. That's what this research tells us. 60% is it's now one of the options. 80% is this is the path. This is the way things are done for new joiners in the company. This is how it happens. But it all starts with 2.5% of the company. Now that's a number, it's a percentage. What is 2.5%? So if you're in a company of 500 people, that's 12 humans. 12 people. A lot of us don't work in companies with 500 people. We may work in companies with 50 people, 100 people. What's 2.5% of 50 people, of 100 people? You're talking about just a few people to build initially the power with, to start moving things forward. You just need a few. It's not daunting to start. So the third idea is big change starts small. First, it starts with you. You emulate that change. Then it starts with active listening, campaign conversations with the people in your team, maybe in your company, finding 5 people, 6 people, 10 people, if you're working in a 500-person company, and building that power together and then incorporating the changes one step at a time. So let's now talk about how we might be able to apply that in practice. We started by talking about this gender-inclusive Slack bot, which I think is really a perfect encapsulation of this conversation because it's a small ask with a great net positive potential gain and yet can be very evocative and emotional reaction, right? So remember this Slack bot and remember the reaction to the Slack bot, which doesn't always happen, thankfully, but often does happen reactions like this. How could we do this differently? Well, I think we can apply our framework, which is we start with ourselves. If we want a space in our companies, in our Slacks, or in our whatever we're using, Element, Matrix, Slack, Discord, you name it, like start with yourself. You want to have a gender-inclusive space? Speak with gender inclusivity in everything you do. In every message, in every asynchronous chat, in every pull request review, in everything. Be inclusive. And then start talking to people in your team. It's natural maybe to start with your own team, just as a place to organically begin. So if you're in like one of the back-end microservice teams or something, like go have a conversation, make a little chat, and engage them with the principles of active listening and start building that narrative. And then we've identified the self-interest, you now have allies who can start building this change with you. And then once you have those allies, you can start doing small things within the company. With the gender-inclusive Slack bot, it might be something like incorporating it into your team's chat. And then from there, incorporating to a chat that is kind of a cross-team chat between your team and maybe one other team. Like maybe you have a chat of like all engineering teams. Right? So you're in your back-end team, and then you have a chat with like the front-end developers and the DevOps people and all this other fun stuff. And you bring it together, and that's like a cross-collaborative chat. So now you bring it there. And then now you build more allies. And now you go from there to something bigger, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, from 2% until you eventually hit 80%. And the reason why we do this is, I think, most articulated in the way a poet can only articulate something, Julia Carney, that little drops of water, doing little actions, over time, can really make the mighty ocean. Thank you very much.